Okay, so we finished last week with the Gemara in Sanhedrin about how the Mashiach will come and how Messianic times will come. The question is, God will bring it in its time or hasten it, and we understand that both are possibilities. We move on to chapter 4 in our book, and we're asking a number of questions at the beginning of chapter 4, and I'll read them to you. Is this the redemption, that is to say, the modern state of Israel? Is this the redemption that Jews dreamt about and prayed for throughout the generations? Is the secular state of Israel the realization of our prophets' visions? Can a state that recognizes reform conversions and tramples on the sanctity of the Shabbos be called redemption? Our prophets promised that Eliyahu
Why do you think
Hanavi,
it tramples on sanctity of the Shabbos?
What? We know that it's not kept as a Torah state.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Our prophets promised that Eliyahu Hanavi and the Messianic king would usher in redemption. Where are they today? These are the four questions we're going to address in this chapter. How will redemption look? People who picture the redemption as a one-day event ask these types of questions, the one we just asked. They imagine that we will hear the sound of the shofar getting louder and louder and louder in the morning, after which the Beis HaMikdash will descend from the heavens, right? And Mashiach will come riding on a white donkey. And the Jewish people will immediately dominate all other nations. This is a one-day event. Right? Mm-hmm. Indeed, some Midrashim describe the redemption in these terms. However, many sources describe it quite differently. I'll give you one example. Rabbi Chia Hagadol, the Great, and Reb Shimon ben Halafta were walking in the Arbel Valley at dawn when they saw the glimmering of the morning star. Right? It's still dark out, and they saw the star that comes out just before the morning. Reb Chia Hagadol said to Reb Shimon ben Halafta, "My master, so is the redemption of Israel at first, little by little, but as it progresses, it grows greater and greater. Why so?" he asked. "When I sit in darkness, the Lord is a light unto me." That's from Micha. Right? So he's asking a question, is the redemption the brightness of the noon sun? Right? Or is it a gradual process, but not gradual in the sense of constantly gradual, but one that grows dramatically? It begins slowly with just the sky begins a little bit light, the morning star comes up, right? But as the sun comes up, right, it increases in speed of brightness as it goes forward. That was his question. Then there's another example from the story of Esther, in Mordecai's process, right? Similarly, at first, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Afterwards, Haman took the garment. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. And afterwards, Mordecai left the king's presence in the royal garment. Remember, in the story of Purim, Haman's wife has a very interesting statement that she says. Zeresh, right? Does anybody remember what she says to her husband? As things are, Haman is very excited after the first meal.
His thing is rising, and that's it. From now
it's
on,
going to be worse for you.
No,
yeah, he says, when the Jews begin to rise, right, it happens increasingly fast, right, and you're finished, basically. It's over for you, right? And she, of course, she was right, in fact.
It's not very supportive wife.
More astute than her husband. This demonstrates that the redemption will not necessarily transpire all at once, as described in the very first paragraph here, but most probably it will be a long process with many stages. Right? So is this a good thing or a bad thing? Right? A slow and gradual redemption has advantages over a quick one. When redemption progresses slowly, the Jewish people have time to reaccustom themselves to living, this is very important, to living as a nation after existing as individuals for over 2,000 years. That is to say, and this is really very much the heart of many of the writings of Rav Kook, is that during our exile, our Roman exile that many of us are still living in, the Jewish reality sometimes felt national. You know, that we had great individuals we looked to and stuff like that, but in fact it never was.
What do you mean felt natural?
National. In the sense that we had great leaders that we could look to, right? All across Europe, or in the Ashkenazi world, or in the Sephardi world. But in fact, it wasn't, because it was never really a nation. It was not always. It was not always a situation. Yeah. For instance, the Abarbanel in Spain. You know, the Golden Gullus of Spain, right? That this was a time in which Jews achieved great success. You know, as a people, they had a big role to play in the Spanish government, even at different times. Right?
But not as a people, as individuals and communities.
But it was communities that never could expand into a nation, because they didn't have the elements that a nation has, which includes a landmass. It includes your own language, it includes currency, it includes your own military. These things they never had. They never had. Although there were many situations in which they were autonomous communities within a greater nation. And it felt like they had authority. But as I like to quote from my grandmother on my father's side, they always locked the gate from the outside in the shtetl. We never locked them out, they locked us out. So even when it felt like we had some control, it was only because the non-Jews allowed us to feel that way.
True. The first ghetto in Italy was locked from inside.
Really?
Maybe in Italy, but...
The first ghetto, it was in Italy, and I believe it was...
Venice?
Venice or Florence, I believe
Venice.
And they locked themselves...
It's an Italian word.
Yeah.
Ghetto?
From grotto.
From...
I think it's from the word grotto.
And they locked themselves from inside.
Mm-hmm. Which makes sense. You close yourself in a house from inside.
Unless you're a prisoner in a country.
Unless you're a prisoner,
Right.
you're locked from outside.
Okay, so let's just continue for a second, okay? One of the reasons the generation of the wilderness stumbled so often, remember they're always complaining, people always talk about this, they're always complaining, they always want to go back, not enough water, not enough meat, not enough, are we here because there are not enough graves in Egypt, etc.
Jews!
Right? One of the reasons the generation of the wilderness stumbled so often was because they left Egypt so quickly and abruptly. Suddenly, by the way, it was a 6-month process, in fact, of preparing to leave. A suddenly freed nation of slaves that never ruled itself or fought a war is bound to have difficulty adjusting to its new situation. This is why Hashem decided to bring the Jews into the land in a roundabout way, as it says. It came to pass, this is from Shemot 13:17, Exodus, it came to pass that when Paro sent the people out, that God did not lead them through the land of the Pushtim, which would have been the short route, because it was near, for God said, perhaps the people will have regrets when they see war, and they will return to Egypt, because there was a civil war going on in Egypt at the time, and this will scare them so much that they'll turn back and say it's better to be under the protection of Pharaoh than to confront this war. Some commentators explain that this is also why the Jews wandered in the desert for 40 years, to allow the creation of a new generation, uninfluenced by slavery. Now, if it was difficult to generate nationalism after 210 years of bondage, what are we to say after 2,000 years of exile? So, this idea, which is usually credited to psychologists, God caused the Jews to wander in the desert because they had a slave mentality. They needed to die off and have a free mentality prior to entering the land, right? Is not a psychological analysis. It predates Freud by roughly 800 years, right?
800?
Roughly 800 years. The Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra was born in Spain. He was a he lived at the same time as the Rashbam, who was the grandson of Rashi, living in the middle of the 10th and 11th century. And he wrote on this very section about this question of when they came to the Yam Suf, we know that they panicked completely. Right? And in the section that goes, I'll read you the translation for where we are. For they said, were it better for us to serve the Egyptians than we should die in the wilderness. And Moshe said to the people, fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For whereas you have seen the Egyptians today, you shall see them no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. And the Lord said to Moshe, wherefore do you cry unto me? Speak unto the children of Israel that they go forward. Even Ezra says on this, it's very interesting. Even Ezra not in fact says, it is referred to in the text of the general statement, they would not listen to Moshe. In any case, there are many things in the Bible that we learn about this only secondarily. For instance, stand by and witness, for you will not be making the war. You will merely see the deliverance which the Lord will work for you today. It is surprising that a camp of 600,000 armed men were afraid of their pursuers and would not fight for their lives and those of their children. The answer, of course, is that the Egyptians had been the Israelites' masters. This is Ibn Ezra speaking. The generation of the Exodus had learned from their youth to bear the yoke of the Egyptians, as opposed to the yoke of God. And they were submissive by nature. How could they suddenly fight their masters? In any case, the Israelites were malingerers and not trained in war.
Malingerers?
Malingerers is the translation of Ibn Ezra. They weren't warriors. They were people who, when they could avoid work and confrontation, they did. Right? They were slaves. You know. Look, when Amalek came upon them, this is Ibn Ezra going on, came upon them with a few men. Had it not been for Moshe's prayer, they would have overwhelmed the Israelites. God, who performs great deeds, he's quoting Job, and by whose actions are measured, arranged for that whole generation to make that whole generation of males to die in the wilderness, says Ibn Ezra. For they would not have had the gumption to fight the Canaanites. So they were replaced by a generation that had not known exile and whose character was noble. And then he goes on to say, see my comments at a later point. Right?
There is children who were younger than 20 years old whose years, like formative years, were spent in
I mean, yeah, that may be true, but as we know that very often people in that situation rebel against their parents' point of view.
The good news is that they were...
Well, they would have, they may very well have seen their parents as, look, God is doing all this for us. How can you think this way?
And why women were okay?
Why women were okay?
Because they were not fighters anyhow?
Well, first of all, they are not fighters. But second of all, we learn over and over in Torah that women connect themselves to Emunah much more effectively than men do. That men, when confronted with very difficult situations, immediately begin to rely on their own abilities. Women often think, there is a resolution to this. It's not for the worst. It may be for the better. Let it play out. That's not an abnormal formula in a household. I can speak from personal experience on this. Okay, let's move on. Okay. So he points out, if this was 210 years of exile, imagine the ability for us to return with a national vision, right, after 2,000 years of exile. Right? This may dovetail with some of the questions about the level of observance and religious commitment. That is to say, one might say that the longer you're in exile, you will seek a religious explanation for that exile. And once you've found that religious explanation for the exile, it may be very, very hard to go beyond it because you're stuck in it.
Yeah, we're
you're stuck in it.
let's...
Whereas people who reject a more observant tradition
Like Jabotinsky.
and maybe look back not at 2,000 years of Chazal, but look back specifically to Tanakh for their understanding of God's ways, might reject the situation of exile when they see the opportunity
because
for redemption.
they have an agenda. Every one of them.
They have to, they're
Sustain
with
the
all due
land,
respect,
yeah.
they're trying
Not
to
the
keep
nation.
Yeah, and they did.
they're trying to keep the people together in an
community,
impossible
the
situation.
community.
But
their
people like
community.
Jabotinsky, even Herzl,
Right.
they are looking at it, okay, we have a bunch of people, couple of, whatever, 14, 15 million people, and they're in difficult, but we have some who are ready to accept, modern take that every nation should
No,
have
not a
land.
modern take. Actually, a very ancient take.
Modern take of that time, and then see, do we have something to lean on in our own history?
Yeah.
Everybody have a land. We have a land too, historic land.
But one could argue from
And they don't
the
accept...
point of view of the divine that both are required. That is to say, to survive the Galus and the exile, you really did need Chazal and all the things they put into place to keep a people who were bereft of their nation and bereft of their national existence as a people, as an identifying people. The process of Chazal was very, very important. However, you could also argue that in order to physically conquer the nation, to win the wars it had to do, to be the pioneers in the nation when the opportunity arose, you may have had to have people that would break with that. We know that the generation of the desert, the leaders of the generation of the desert, with very few exceptions, Yaakov, Caleb, Joshua and Caleb, but with their exception, it was a requirement for new leadership in the land for many reasons. It's just something to think on. When the Jews ate the Paschal lamb in Egypt, they ate it hastily. In their future, however, it says in the Medrash Shmos Rabbah, you will not leave hastily, nor will you go in flight. Right? It's going to be a different process. Yerushalmi quoted above alludes to this reason when it cites the verse, when I sit in darkness, the Lord is a light unto me. One who sits in darkness cannot look at a bright light all at once. Hashem did us a great service by making the sun rise gradually. Our eyes would suffer damage if the light and the darkness interchanged quickly. It's a
And
Midrash tale.
from experiential point of view, when you look at Israel and look at Israelis, they're very comfortable with the idea that they have a state, they're a nation, it happened, it did happen. Our eyes got used to it.
It's an interesting thing for us during the 10 days of tshuva between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We daven, we're saying slichos, there's a lot of things we do, but most people go to work during that time. If you have to get your passport renewed, you go to the government office and get it renewed. Right? there's a big problem with entering Israel just before Rosh Hashanah. Because for the following month, most government offices are closed for that month, most of the time. You can't get anything done. Banks are closed. All the normal things.
Gesher?
Means bridge.
Right.
Between here and...
No, it's between holidays. There are so many holidays in Tishrei,
Right.
so they just make bridge.
So if you're going to move to Israel and do all the things you have to do to set up to make Aliyah, they don't advise you do it, 10 days before Rosh Hashanah, because there's a lot of government buildings and that you have to deal with, and there's banks you have to deal with, and
Factories,
all those
yeah.
things, factories, right? And you're going to find that you've walked into a country that is shut down, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And for somebody who's lived their lives in exile, it's a surprise. When I was growing up in New York, I know that specifically on Yom Kippur and on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, non-Jewish stores would have a sign on it, right? It said, "We're closed out of respect to our Jewish clientele." Right? Now, so on those days, Jews who are not even very religious still were going to shul. They weren't doing business, right? So you didn't miss it. But on the second day of Rosh Hashanah and virtually all other days, including Sukkot, right, those stores were open. It was a normal time of business. But not in Israel, because Israel really is a Jewish state, and its government is Jewish, its government offices are Jewish, its banks are Jewish. So it's impacted by Shabbos and by all the Hagim. Previous redemptions occurred gradually, albeit at a quicker pace than today's. When the Jews left Egypt, their spiritual condition was so bad that even Moshe felt that they did not deserve to be redeemed. We talked about this previously. Nonetheless, Hashem took them out of Egypt, and there is no doubt that this was the beginning of redemption, even though they were in such a great state of tumah. Right? In this first stage, the nation achieved physical independence without improving its spiritual standing. The ultimate goal of this redemption, to transform Israel into a godly nation, came to fruition only 49 days later, when they received the Torah at Har Sinai. So they were working, improving themselves. The second redemption was a long process. At first, the exiles returned to Eretz Israel. We know this is the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, the story of Esther. Right? In the story of Esther, it's a very interesting thing to notice. We're coming to Hanukkah and then to Purim. Right? So there's something that is not mentioned in the story of Esther, which seems to be a big vacuum. Nobody mentions Israel or Jerusalem. This was a time prior to the story when the Jews under Zerubbabel had returned and were in the midst of rebuilding the temple and changing the land. Then, after the Esther story, Ezra and Nehemiah go with another group. But it's not as though nothing was going on in Israel at that time. But there's no mention of it at all.
But the idea of Habirah...
We talk about allusions to it in many different ways. Allusions to the idea of the temple vessels is an allusion to the fact that God himself left Eretz Yisrael, the Shekhinah left Eretz Yisrael with his vessels, so to speak. Those vessels returned, by the way, with Zerubbabel. It specifically says Koresh gave the vessels back to that group returning to Israel. Now I know the question you're going to ask. What vessels is Achashverosh using? It seems there may have been vessels that he didn't send back as well. Right? But what I'm saying is that in the story of Esther, it's really strange that there is no mention, of this. And the reason was because Babylon had become their home. There wasn't a great yearning at that point. The Jews were doing pretty well in Babel.
Yes,
they had a lot of autonomy.
The entire elite of Jews were sitting there.
Some of the elite went back with Zerubbabel, but not that many. Right? There's a list of them in the book of Ezra. So, nonetheless, Hashem took them out of Egypt. Right? Where are we? The ultimate goal of this redemption was to transform Israel to a godly nation. And it only came to fruition 49 days later. The second redemption was a long process. At first, the exiles returned to Eretz Israel and established a small Jewish state, despite the fact that most of them lived devoid of Torah and mitzvot. Right? They had a Jewish state without Judaism. In this state, too, they violated Shabbos, designating it as a market day in Jerusalem. Still, there is no doubt that this process was the beginning of the second redemption. Intermarriage was rampant. Israel did not achieve full sovereignty or improve its spiritual state until the time of the Maccabees, 200 years after the beginning of the redemption. Right? Mm-hmm. So there was the struggle of, call it Persianism, right, became a struggle later on of Hellenism, right? That's to say, it was not a transformation. We're going back and, creating this Jewish state, right? When Ezra came, he was quite shocked about what was in front of his face. And we know that he's described as a very, very strict person, right? And we know that the high priest's children were intermarried and he forced them to divorce their wives and separate from them. The poor redemption occurred in a similar fashion, as Yerushalmi demonstrates. First, there was a small measure of political salvation. Mordecai received a position of authority, sitting at the gates. Later, Esther put Mordecai in charge of Haman's estate, but the decree to annihilate the Jews was not yet annulled. Finally, towards the end of the process, the Jews reaffirmed their loyalty to Torah. Right? So this is the second redemption. The first one happened the fastest, and it was quite a rocky start. The second was slower, but there were a lot of problems. What about the third redemption? Various chapters in Tanakh describe the third and final redemption in different ways. Yehezkel's dry bones vision is one of the most famous accounts, and it delineates two stages of redemption. Remember, it says, in the valley of the dry bones, they will come together and march on to Israel. First, Yehezkel sees dry bones being covered with flesh and skin, but they have no spirit. Then Yehezkel calls out to the spirit, and the bones come alive. Afterwards, Yehezkel prophesies that the final redemption will unfold in the same way. First, the Jews will ascend to Eretz Yisrael, and only afterwards Hashem will infuse them with His Spirit. Therefore, prophesy and say to them, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I will open your graves and raise you out of your graves, my people, and I will bring you to the soil of Israel. You will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and when I raise you out of your graves, my people. And I will put my spirit in you. So that's first physically, and now I will put my spirit in you, and you will come alive, and I will place you on your soil. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, says the Lord. Yehezkel. This is Yehezkel, right?
My understanding that raising out of the grave happens somewhere before you getting back to the soil.
There's three stages. Raising you out of the grave.
But
right?
Not in Israel.
Right. No, not in Israel. Definitely not in Israel. Right.
But where is it?
And I will bring you to the soil, and I will infuse you with the Spirit. It's in that order. Right. The description of many of the people who came from the DP camps after the Shoah was literally the Walking Dead. You see the pictures, and it was people who seemed to be hanging on by a thread to life at this point, right? And many of them were, founders of the new state. Many rabbinic sources as well describe the redemption as a process consisting of many stages. According to the Talmud, Megillah 17b, Israel's final redemption will begin with the ingathering of the exiles, continue with the rejuvenation of Eretz Yisrael after centuries of desolation, and only at the end the temple will be rebuilt and Mashiach will arrive. Notably, the order of blessings in the Shemona Esrei, the most important prayer in the Jewish liturgy, recited 3 times a day, is based on this description of redemption. We'll go into this more next week, which will be Hanukkah. We might talk a little bit about Hanukkah too, because it's so much about redemption at that time.